This is the Jazz Violin Podcast, episode 65, and today I'm chatting with Christian Howes. The Jazz Violin Podcast is a podcast aimed at people who love jazz violin, who are learning to play jazz violin, who are already playing jazz violin, or who like listening to other people talking about jazz violin. First off, I'm just going to talk to you about Patreon. If you love the podcast and you'd like to support us, you can do so by giving us a very small amount of money every month on Patreon. My podcast patrons get the opportunity to ask me any question about learning jazz violin, or just learning violin, or just jazz violin in general, and have it read out and answered on the podcast. I'll be reading out one of those questions and answers at the end of this episode. Patreon is also the place that you can get involved in my teaching. There are a bunch of different tiers on Patreon, where you get varying degrees of access to all of the teaching material that I produce every month. I have a course on there for people who are just starting out playing jazz. I have weekly guided practice sessions with me every Monday evening. I have the opportunity to get one-to-one feedback from me, all based on what you need. I do monthly live streams for all of my Patreon people, and I also do a monthly live Q&A. If you're learning to play jazz violin, I think I can help you. The link is in the description of this podcast. And lastly, before we move on to this month's guest, I want to just talk to you about a crowdfunder campaign for a young UK-based jazz violinist, Casey White. She's been offered a place at Berklee College of Music in the US, and she needs just a little bit of help from you guys and all of us in the jazz violin community to get her there. She's an amazing player, and I have no doubt in my mind that she's going to be one of the very best musicians playing jazz on the violin in the world. I don't know anybody who deserves this opportunity more. The link is in the description of this video. This month, I chatted to Christian Howes for the second time. I've chatted to Christian before, back in the day, in the very early, maybe in the first year of me running the podcast, I chatted to Christian. He is an amazing musician and teacher. He's been teaching violinists how to play improvised styles and alternative styles since 2011 with his Creative Strings program. He's played all over the world and has won countless awards for his musicianship and for his teaching. Like I said, this is the second time I've spoken to him, but we had so much to talk about, and he came out with some really amazing gems of information for new starter jazz violinists. Check it out. Thanks for doing this, man. That's I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for asking me.
I reckon it'd be cool to start with this question that I've been giving people. If you had one piece of advice, you only had 5 minutes with somebody who wants to learn to play jazz violin, and you only had a chance to give them one piece of advice before they ran away and started learning on their own, what would that piece of advice?
It's hard for me to answer the question. What is one piece of advice? I'll try to give a couple, because I've spent a lot of time thinking about this.
I'm sure
so I feel like it's a very multi-pronged thing. So maybe my one piece of advice would be don't underestimate the complexity of what you're getting into. Don't oversimplify it. Maybe that would be it. Don't make assumptions about what it even is, because if you don't know what you don't know. So one piece of advice I would give is, you don't know what you don't know, and assume that to be true. Assume that there is a path forward for you if you want to learn jazz violin, or if you want to learn to be an improviser. Assume that you can do it, and assume that some of your assumptions about it are not going to be true. Assume that it might look differently than you envision. How are you going to get there? So can I give some more context for that?
Sure.
One of the first things that I usually say to new students coming to me who say that they want to learn jazz is I really say, but do you actually want to learn jazz or do you want to learn something else? And the way that we define jazz, I think, is really convoluted, and it just means different things for different people. So I've started thinking about the subject in kind of a different way, which is, well, do you want to learn harmony and improvisation? And do you want to learn to be a functional musician outside of orchestra or outside of classical chamber music? Do you want to go beyond playing prescribed parts, whether those are written prescribed parts or whether you learned them by ear, because even a lot of fiddle tradition players learn prescribed parts exclusively always also. So the way I've started to frame the question is, would you like to go beyond playing prescribed parts? And if so, there's lots of ways to do that that don't have to be defined as jazz. And I would even argue that trying to go directly from playing prescribed parts into playing quote unquote jazz can be more difficult and somewhat discouraging for people because of the harmonic complexity of jazz and the amount of conventional knowledge that goes into jazz, which we could also say is true of the conventions of playing bluegrass, or, you know, just the amount of knowledge that it might take until you could really feel that you're a part of that tradition. Now, on the other hand, you could start improvising immediately. You could start understanding harmony and learning to navigate the harmonic material of a huge amount of music out there very quickly if you let go of this idea that I want to be a burning jazz musician right away. You know, I want to be able to play my own solos over jazz standard songs like All of Me or Take the A Train or whatever, you know, Minor Swing, whatever it is. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but that is one of the biggest things that I find. And so I've been focused more on teaching musicians what I call fundamental skills that can be applied across universal styles. Because I think that that's, like I said, you know, how do you understand harmony? How do you understand song form? How do you understand being able to accompany people in different songs and be functional outside of classical music? Improvising in your own way, that I find can be a bridge to playing in many, many more musical contexts, styles, and situations.
It's a very interesting point, and I feel like it's a point that comes from a lot of teaching of a lot of different people looking for a lot of different things. Because I think I mean, you more so than me, but I've seen it a little bit in the past or nowadays. People they do come to you saying they want to learn jazz or thinking they want to learn jazz, but actually they might not really love jazz like itself. They might not actually have a huge passion for the music itself. They might not have a huge passion for the history of it. They might not, they might think it's cool, and I think it's a really good point that you make, and it's like, just work out exactly what it is, because jazz itself is a whole world, and the learning of jazz might not even entail as much, especially at the beginning, as much improv as you might think, because it's part of it is understanding the style and understanding the tradition. Whereas I think what I think is quite enabling about what you're saying for people is, hey, why don't you start with just with changing your mindset, and maybe the jazz or the not jazz doesn't matter so much. It's about changing the way you practice, the way that you look at music, and the way you dissect music. Is that right?
Yeah, totally. And I guess if I were to dial more into that, I would say that, like, one of the things about jazz is the language of swing rhythm, and that in and of itself is like a language that takes a long time to get comfortable around, number one. another aspect of jazz language is this particular harmony, the particular harmonic language, which also takes time. And then there's like learning lots of tunes, which takes time. And as you kind of hinted at, I think, yeah, a lot of students, they might use jazz as a kind of a stand-in for what they don't, they don't really listen to, like, whatever it might be, jazz records of any particular style, whether it's jazz from the 60s or jazz manouche or traditional jazz or fusion jazz or post-bop or whatever it might be. They may not really listen to that all the time. And even just throwing out those different categories can be helpful, by the way, right? So if you ask somebody like, well, what period of jazz are you most interested in starting with? A lot of violin players will say, well, I want to sound like Stefan Grappelli, if they think that they want to be a jazz musician. And they'll say that they want to do kind of that, I guess, jazz manouche or hot club jazz style, which is fine if that's really what they want to do. But again, it is tricky. And I would still say to them, if you want to play in that style of jazz, I would still say let's break it down and let's work on some fundamental harmonic exercises, and let's work on some fundamental improvisation exercises, and let's work on some fundamental rhythm exercises. These are all three things. And within the context of harmony, I would break it down to scalar exercises and chordal exercises. And when I say chordal exercises, it doesn't mean that you have to be playing triple stops the whole time, although that's great if you can. But it is examining chords, examining voice leading, examining arpeggios in probably a much deeper way than you're expecting. And the same thing with scale exercises is to give people some deeper scale exercises that require a lot of internalization, a lot of slow practice memorization, different types of scale exercises than what we do as classical practicers and students. And getting that foundation from some of those things. Of course, you can still learn some tunes, but I would rather really focus on these foundations, because I also find that there's a lot of emotional resistance around learning a new thing. That's daunting. There certainly was for me. And I think the more trained you have been as a classical musician, maybe the more fear and the more insecurity you'll have about becoming starting as a beginner in something else. Part of that is I think that we make an assumption that one of the biggest assumptions that I think really hurts us when we're starting in jazz and we're coming from a classical, especially if we've had an extensive training in classical music, is that we think, well, if I'm a good musician, then I should just be able to do this stuff. I should just be able to hear it. I should just be able to improvise. I should just be able to do all these things. And it's a really harmful to yourself if you're if you're making that assumption. And so then it'll kind of hang you up in this limbo of denial, or I like to say that we kind of go through these radical extremes. On one hand, we're just making this, we're saying I'm the best thing ever, and on the other we're like, I'm completely worthless, I can't do it, I can't, very unhealthy extremes. Whereas the healthy middle ground would be like, hey, come to a teacher and get some really solid exercises where you can start from some solid things and do them. Now, another harmful assumption that people make is that they think that, in fact, maybe this would be my one of my single answers to your original question, is they think, well, I really want to learn jazz or improvisation or whatever, but I already practice for 90 minutes every day, and so when am I going to make the time for it? So, and I would say it's really important that you integrate your practice and you change the way you practice, not make more time at the end for these quote unquote other things. So most classical players, if they have a practice routine, it looks like something like warm up, scales exercises, scales and etudes, and repertoire, something like that, right? So I would say, aside from your classical repertoire, I would say all of your warm up, all your scales and exercises can all be integrated with studying harmony, studying improvisation, and studying rhythm. And even your repertoire can be integrated with new repertoire. You know, like if you get the Charlie Parker Omni book, which is just transcriptions of all his a bunch of his melodies and solos, like that's awesome repertoire. Like that's gonna, you know, it's gonna make you a better classical violin player if you practice out of that book, and you can just read it straight down. So, sorry, I'm kind of rambling.
No. You're not rambling. You're not rambling. I think you're putting into words. I think, yeah. I mean, this is like with your first answer, as in it all comes from experience. It seems like this all comes from experience of teaching a lot of people, and also doing it yourself, right? There was obviously a point in your life when you've had to go through all of these realizations. Probably not enough time to practice, so you know need to find a way of making that practice work for two things: technique and improv. So no, it's all good. I agree with you very much. So I should have written down what you were saying in the middle because I did have a point to make. But yeah, I agree with you very much. So I think that if you don't mind me. If you don't mind me rounding off sort of what you've said there,
please.
Is it seems like the main point that you have is really work out exactly what you want first of all, rather than just jumping straight into something and going down a path that maybe isn't what you want. Actually this is what came to me actually is the idea of people saying I want to learn jazz. I'm ready to learn jazz. I want to do it. And then probably somebody saying to them, oh, okay, well, then you probably want to learn stuff like Grappelli. And they go, okay, good. Yeah, that's a good idea. And as you said, because people, if you are at the beginning of your journey, you don't know what you don't know. Exactly, coming back to your first point. And you might end up down that road just because someone told you to, or just because you thought that that's maybe what you have to do, and then you end up you can easily, and this is not your point, but my point, is you can easily end up getting to a point where you're that's what you do, but you don't really love it, you know. And I've actually seen it with people before, not getting too far down the road, but I think that it's really important what you said in that before you even embark on the learning, really take some time working out exactly what it is that you want to get out of it and where you want to be, and having that vision will mean that you will be successful rather than just sort of going blindly. Okay, well, just following a new thing. It's exciting, and then going, I don't know, something else, I guess, and moving on. So I agree with you, I guess, is my point. Guys, thanks so much for listening to this episode. It was amazing to chat with Christian, and I hope you got just as much out of it as I did. Time for questions. Let's have a little look at my questions. Okay, from John, who is one of my Patreon people. Can you suggest a practice technique to build up speed? And actually, Alison Foyle also seconded this question. So today I'm going to be chatting about playing fast. I think there's no real one-stop solution for playing fast. Obviously, there's that old thing that people say where if you can play it slow, you can play it fast. And I do agree with that to some degree. Anything that you want to be able to play fast, you have to be able to play it slow. However, practicing things slowly is not going to help you play things fast on its own. If you do want to learn to play fast, in my opinion, you do have to do a little bit of searching. So you want to find your own techniques and your own way around the problem of playing fast. If you find playing fast classical music okay, and you find that you're technically able to play very quickly when you're not improvising, then it really is just about trying to do it as much as possible. So adding a little extra bit of practice into your practice schedule, where you put a backing track on much too fast for you, and you try and find your way around improvising at that speed. So my advice to people who can already play fast technically but find it hard to improvise fast is to actually just do it. Turn on that backing track really, really fast and find your way of doing it. Use your technique and find your own way around that problem of playing fast. Now, if you technically find it hard to play fast already, then it really is about slowly building up. And you can do this whilst you're learning to improvise. So I would say this is where using iRealbook is actually quite a good thing to do, because you can set the speed of it incrementally in very small increments. You can go up by 1 BPM. So I would find your happy place on iRealbook with a tune that you're working on, and sit on that for 5 minutes, and then you're going to say, right, I'm going to go up by 5 BPM, and you're going to do that for 5 minutes. Hopefully that still feels quite comfortable. You're going to go up another 5 BPM, and you're going to do that for 5 minutes. Now, it's just going to take a lot of time. You're not going to be able to do it straight away. It really is about incrementally going up and staying where you're sort of comfortable, and then maybe pushing it to the point that you're just a little bit uncomfortable and staying there for a little bit longer. So when you start to feel like you're uncomfortable, things are just a little bit too fast for you, it's now you're going to stay there for maybe even a week, and you're going to get to the point where that feels super comfortable, and then you're going to go incrementally up when you feel like you can do. It's really hard to do this because it's hard to have that self-control, but it really is the best way to get from I can't play fast to I can sort of play fast. Now, last piece of advice is to learn to play slow over fast tunes. Listening to musicians like Louis Armstrong and even Stefan Grappelli and Django, they had great ways of sort of playing over fast tunes and sort of soaring over it. Specifically, actually, Louis Armstrong. If you spend a little bit of time trying to find ways to play nice melodies, nice slow melodies over fast tunes. The one thing that we hear is 1, 2, 3, 4. Here's a nice little simple technique for playing. Here's a nice little simple technique for playing rhythmically. Here's a nice simple Here's a nice simple triplet technique that Louis Armstrong used all the time. Let's say we've got a tempo like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's just take away all of the numbers apart from 1. 1. And in between those claps, we're actually going to fit 6 rather than 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1. And we're going to use that as a basis for improvising. So if you're playing a tune like this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, you can soar over the top of it with this triplet-y sound. Now you can create decent melodies within those 6 notes. We're basically playing triplets over 4. It's basically 3 over 4. And it's something that you hear Louis Armstrong doing all the time. So that's my little piece of advice for anybody who's trying to play fast jazz, and certainly fast swing or fast old style jazz. Have a little listen to Louis and try and work on that triplet feel that he does. Guys, thanks so much for listening today. If you'd like to have your questions read out on the podcast, you can become a podcast patron on my Patreon account. You can also get involved with all of my other teaching on there as well. The link is in the description. Thanks very much for listening.